Welcome everybody. As you're coming in, it'd be cool to see who we've got in the room, see where you're from. When I looked at the list originally, there were quite a few different countries represented, so it'd be really cool to find out where you're all from. Just going to open up the chat box here. So yeah, as you're coming on, thank you. Pouring in, it's really cool. I think we had over 100 people registered, so we're hoping for a really good attendance today. I'm looking forward to sharing some useful information, hopefully, with you. Cape Town, fantastic. My hometown, love it. Welcome. Who else we got? Cape Town, sure, come on, where's the Nigerias, the Kenyas, the other parts of South Africa on the list? I know you're there. There we go, Nigeria, at last represented, fantastic. Really good to see you, thank you. Pretoria, cool. I'll make this a little bit bigger. Yep, keep them coming. So we've got a couple of minutes before we, or 1 minute before we start. And I'll try and start as close to the designated time as possible. We've got quite a lot of people still coming in, so we'll give them a chance. Johannesburg, welcome. Great, so yes, we're going to talk about a little, the first part's going to be a little bit of informational. So we'll be going through some of the concepts that act as a framework, and then we'll go into the Applied Directorship program. So if you're keen on finding out more about the Applied Directorship program, please stay till the end. Cool, keep coming, keep coming. And I think what we'll try and do is start on time, and then if anybody joins later, then they can pick it up as we go. Great, still coming in. I'll repeat it again, but yeah, please put any questions in the question box or in the chat box, whichever you feel most comfortable with, and then we'll cover those at the end. Jenny, if you can just keep an eye if there's one that comes up that's relevant to the specific slides that we're talking about at the moment, then please let me know, and then we can answer it when it's relevant, I suppose, rather than all at the end. Cool, Johannesburg, Pretoria, another Cape Town. Great, keep them coming. So let us know where you're from if you missed that earlier. We had someone registered from Cameroon. I'm interested to see if they come along. That'd be really, really special. Johannesburg, fantastic. Cool, well, it's 4 o'clock. Let's kick into it in honor of those of you who are on time. Really appreciate it. So as I said, what we're talking about today is about general background, some framework information about the three hats, the difference between a director, a shareholder and a manager. I'll also talk a little bit about director's duties, etc., really to set the scene, and then we'll go into more detail about our Applied Directorship program, where we teach all this stuff. Ooh, there we go. So Sirdar South Africa is the global leader in education appointment and guide of high performance boards. So that's our specialization, and particularly in privately held and family businesses. So for those of you who aren't necessarily from a private business or a family business, it's not to say that the education programs and the support won't be relevant. It's just that's where we've came from. That's the experience we've built on. And we've largely found that it's absolutely applicable in bigger organizations where the opposite is not necessarily true. So much more of a mentorship approach in terms of the way that privately held and family businesses need that support, whereas corporates have obviously got a little bit more infrastructure, a little bit more professionalism maybe in their teams, so they've got a few more skills in there that they can call on. And the name Sirdar, for those of you who haven't heard of it, comes from the lead Sherpa, name for the lead Sherpa on a mountain expedition. So there'll be a few pictures of mountains in the presentation dotted around. And the idea is that the Sherpa leads you on the journey. It's a partnership. You travel with the team. So it's about making sure that at base camp, everybody's got the right training, they've got the right equipment, they're properly prepared at base camp at the beginning of the journey or as early in the journey as possible before you head for that summit. So like building a business, you need to have a plan, you need to be prepared, because as you climb higher in a mountain, the air gets thinner, gets more difficult, mistakes become more and more bigger, and they ultimately become potentially fatal. And business is very similar. As you're growing a business, as you get a bigger business, the air becomes more rarefied, decisions become much more critical, you have less room to make errors. So that's the analogy we use. And we're working primarily in education. So the Applied Directorship program is one of those courses, very many but bespoke education, one-day workshops, etc. We do appointment of directors. So we have an appointed team that will help find non-exec directors for you. And then guidance is about guiding the board on an ongoing journey. So it's an ongoing support service where we'll take a business along a journey for maybe years, where we support the board, help it to become more effective, help it to become high performance, which is what we talk about, and which I'll talk about briefly today. And then the new components are, we've got a preferred board software, board meeting software package called Onboard. So we use Onboard for quite a lot of our clients, and it's our preferred solution for that, those e-meetings and onboard electronic board papers, which is a major move and major improvement from the PDFs and the paper-based systems that have been used in the past. And we also have quite a close relationship with Contribution Compass, and I'll probably mention that in a minute about how we build teams. So moving on, let's work out how these buttons are working. Yeah, there we go. What drives me and what drives Sirdar, I think, is this concept of the difference between good directors and great directors. And what we mean by that is that great directors have the potential, if they're running a board effectively, if they're really driving a company to its full potential, to radically change lives. And we've seen that in the companies we're working with that have developed or have already got strong boards. They've really made a meaningful economic impact and a really meaningful difference in the companies that they work with and the stakeholders that are impacted by those companies, whether it be managing to hold on to the staff, managing to give benefits that they probably wouldn't have done otherwise because they've got the capacity to do so, by giving back to the community, etc., etc. Those are the kinds of decisions we need to be thinking about as really great directors. It's all of the stakeholders that we can impact as a business, not just potentially good directors or what might be called good directors who've produced good performance as their sort of primary measure. In other words, shareholders are happy, but there may not have been that broader context of what do they have, what's their impact on the world, the community, and the people they're engaged with. So it's certainly something that I work on very hard, is trying to get to the point where we're training great directors and ideally trying to live up to that, being a great director. So a little bit about me, in case you've picked up the wonky accent. I'm not truly South African. I've been here nearly half my life, but I was born in the UK and came here in 1992 and have no intention of going anywhere else. So those of you who are dithering, I'm solidly here, made it here, and I'm not going anywhere. Been with Sirdar since 2013. Before that, I was in IT. So I was an MD of an IT company, and I worked as a consultant for many years in an asset management software company. So a lot of IT background, which has become, and before that was even an engineering degree, but both of those have become really useful when I'm sitting on boards now to have that context of how important technology is, and also having to be able to understand manufacturing businesses a lot more detailed level than otherwise it might be. So I'm really interested to find out a little bit more about you, and specifically about how or what role you have. So Jenny, if you can just put that poll up for me, please. So are you a shareholder manager? In other words, are you wearing all three hats, which I'll talk about in a second? Or are you an executive director, or you're a non-exec director, or an aspiring non-exec director? So tick all of the ones that apply. So if you're a shareholder manager, please tick all the boxes, just to get some feel if we've got in the room. And then I can make sure that I try to talk to each of you, because obviously you've got slightly different requirements coming out of particularly training and certainly with engagement with a company like Sirdar. Good, so we got quite an even spread. That's fantastic. Quite a few aspiring non-exec directors. Some non-exec directors, brilliant. So we'll talk about the difference between executive and non-exec as well. Awesome. I think, is that everybody? There's a couple more. Give it 2, 3, 2, 1. Okay. 3 to go. Come on, guys. Okay. Share the results, Jenny, please. So a really even split. Thank you. And good to see this. We've got some Shelled managers in the room, so I'll talk a lot about that. And we will definitely talk about the difference between executive and non-executive directors, because it's critical to understanding the role of both of those and how different they are, but also the difference in responsibilities. And I'm looking forward to the aspiring non-executive directors either finding you a position through the appoint service or to train you so that you're better skilled and able to deliver at a higher level using some of our training programs. So welcome to today. Jenny, you can just close that now. Thanks very much. Or share the results. Can you share the results? There we go. So a really good even split. Thank you. Oops. So please, before we get too far into this, I'm assuming, there's a big assumption, there was some kind of question you wanted answered as part of this session. So please write that down, either put it in the chat box, make a note on a piece of paper, and then make sure that I've covered it off at the end, and make sure that if I haven't, then you ask that question. So I want to make sure you leave today having any questions or things you're unsure of answered or described. So please make a note now. And Lagos, Nigeria, well done. Thank you. Congratulations for joining. Thank you. Okay. Comment entrepreneurs, different class. Well, unfortunately, shareholder managers have all kinds of challenges. Hopefully class is not one of them. Right, so what we're going to do is start with the end in mind. And the idea is, let's build a picture, or try to build a picture of what a high performance board and a high performance director looks like, so that you can make a choice about whether that's something you want to move towards. Because if you really get it and understand it, then that's when the power of an understanding of why a board's so important starts to come to play. If you can really understand what a high performance board has the potential to do, then it's starting to work towards that and build that mechanism into the way you run your business. So what does a high performance board comprise of? So there are 3 main components in our mind. And the main one obviously is the director, but the other 2 are not so commonly known. So director is obvious. As soon as you sign up to form a business, you have to designate at least 1 director. So there's always at least 1 when the company becomes alive. And then you've added maybe 1 or 2 more going forward. But have you actually developed a team as a board of directors? Do you have meetings? Do you make decisions as a team? Or is it all a bit ad hoc? Have you professionalized that process? And the other part of the team is the team that supports the board. So when you're having the meetings, where's the information coming from? Is there someone or a group of people that are checking it? Have you got an exco team? Have you got a solid management team or general management team that's providing the information you need to make good decisions as a board and as directors? And then the third piece, which is often missing completely, is some kind of methodology, some kind of way of doing this stuff. Because typically we're not taught it at school, we're not taught at university. And I know that having done my MBA and various other colleagues have also done their MBAs, I was expecting there would be a little bit more instruction on governance and what your responsibilities are as a director, but it's still even now quite minimal. So it's important that you have a methodology. Sirdar has a methodology, and I'm sure there are others out there, but it's important to pick one. So what is your process? How do you run your meeting? What is the order that you have in your agenda? What is your planning process? Do you have a pre-board meeting, before the board meeting? How many days before the meeting do the papers go out? How do you describe and discuss things? What is the layout of that kind of information so it makes it really easy to assimilate and actually get through and get decisions made in the board meeting, etc. So make sure you've got well qualified and trained directors. Make sure that you're working as a team, as a board of directors, but also you have a team that supports you, that understands the importance of this process and their role in making sure this process is effective. And then the last piece is having the actual plan, the system that you run to keep this engine going. So our definition of a high-performance director is one who is obsessed with creating meaningful economic impact through their role on the board and the role their company plays in the economy. Furthermore, such a director is not afraid to have the tough conversations as well as do the mundane aspects that together enable board success. So first thing which has come up a few times is, well, is it just economic? In my mind, certainly economic is much broader than just getting paid. It's much more about the impact you have with creating opportunities so that someone can get paid down the line, or creating opportunities where someone has received something, received some benefit that they would otherwise have to pay for. So what's the measure is that their lifestyle improves, or their opportunities improve, or their status and their ability to operate in their economy improves, and their community improves. So they have a downstream impact. And it's important that the board understands that and understand that's part of their role. So we talked about the broader stakeholder engagement. But it's really, really key that as a director, we have the tough conversations. So this is where non-executive directors really start to add value, because it's talking about improving the process of the board, but being that lone voice, standing up and saying, this is not the way we do things. This is an opportunity that we're not seeing. This is a risk that we're not seeing. Guys, we've got to pay attention. We can't just rush ahead. So it's critical, particularly as non-exec directors, that we take that position, we take that place, that take that role in the meeting. And also the mundane aspects is about making sure that the stuff's done, the admin's done, the minutes are done, that they're recorded properly, resolutions are written down, that you prepare for the board meetings properly, you read the papers. All of those kind of things are mundane, but they're absolutely critical as a director to make sure that you're performing. And the last piece is that obsessed. This is a 24/7 job as a director. This is not 3-4 times a year, 6 times a year thing. You are responsible and should be thinking about the business you're on the board of, a director of, all the time. Because if management has a problem, they have nowhere else to go, and they need access 24/7. They need to be able to reach out to get that advice at that critical moment. And that's where it's critical that the directors are there for it. High performance board, one through rhythm and decision making, holds the company accountable to a performance standard higher than it has ever had before. So those of you who were chirping about being entrepreneurs, I know this is the most difficult part of bringing a board into play in your company, is that at some point you will be held a little bit more accountable than you're used to. So if you formed a business to not be told what to do, not have a boss, then unfortunately, as your business grows, that you can't run away from that. There's a stage where some kind of accountability is necessary, and that's where a board comes into play. So it's about making sure the business, the company, is held accountable to performance. So it's not just individuals, it's the whole business. So what are we doing in terms of managing performance of individual units, the individual team members, etc., etc.? Are we setting proper KPIs? Are we doing all of the things we need to do to make sure that we're monitoring and managing the performance at the level it needs to? And it's not just improving return to shareholders, it's the impact on all stakeholders. And this diagram really is just a way of coalescing all this stuff to give you an understanding of how they all hold together. So in order to shift company performance, there's one of two things that need to be present. You need to have strong directors to pull the lever. So think of that straight line as the lever. And you need a strong boardroom composition and structure to act as the pivot. So it's all very well if one director is really strong, but if they haven't got a team that they can lean on and leverage off, then they're not going to have the impact on company performance that they otherwise could. So it's really important that you have both strong directors and that strong boardroom to be able to move the business forward, to really have and impact and lever that company performance upwards. And leadership, governance, continual working process. This stuff doesn't stop. It just keeps going, and it keeps getting more and more difficult. It never gets easier. So continuous learning is critical, both in a leadership role and a governance role. And that's one of the reasons why we developed the Directorship program and made it such a comprehensive program, was because we realized that most people had quite significant gaps in their knowledge and understanding of the role. So what's craft or enterprise? And what is the difference between a craft or enterprise? So what often happens is a business starts and it's based on the skill and ability of an individual, a craftsman. So in ancient times, that was the way pretty much all businesses were started. And that craftsman was usually sponsored by the church or the state or the king or whatever it might be. But it was a craftsman who had a particular skill, whether it was making beer, making bread, be able to build buildings. They were the master craftsmen, and they employed craftsmen and apprentices below them. Often we start businesses in the same kind of way. We have a particular skill and ability, and we've taken it to market, and we're selling a product and service that we are very good at delivering. The difference is what happens next. So if you are setting the business up as an enterprise, which is about a team, is about an entity that has a value in and of itself, versus a craft, which is about the individual and building their skill and ability and their hourly rate, et cetera, et cetera. The first person you need to employ needs to be in a craft, it will be someone who knows less than you. In an enterprise, ideally, you should be employing the next person as someone who knows more than you in an area which you know you're poor at. Because then from day one, you start building a team. And it's the team that drives the organization, and it's not reliant on any one individual. So it's about this concept of the difference between an entrepreneur and an enterprise, because they come from the same place. So an entrepreneur comes up with the idea. And as I said, then it's either you go to the craft direction, which is absolutely valid, it's just a different way of making a living, versus the enterprise, which is about building a company. So the entrepreneur has the idea, makes the promise to the market. Then the enterprise carries that promise, holds that promise, delivers on that promise. And if they've built a solid enterprise, the entrepreneur now has the option to come up with the next idea or continue to innovate in the enterprise that they're currently existing in. But it's critical that just by its very nature, the entrepreneur hands over the promise to something else, which is called the enterprise, which is the company, to take it forward. And what is the role of director? So it's about strategy, it's about leadership, and it's about governance. So governance is the obvious one, but what seems to be a confusion in some places is that understanding that the board is responsible for the strategy. Doesn't mean they develop it in isolation. They collect information from management, they collect information from the CEO, collect information from wherever they can to craft that strategy, but the board owns it and drives the accountability bit coming in, drives the delivery of that down through the organization. And it's about leadership, because if the board aren't taking a leadership role, aren't demonstrating leadership, then it just impacts the rest of the company. Everybody can see it, they slack off, etc., etc. And what is governance? Well, that piece is more about then the administration of the things which you've decided as a board. So the strategy, how do you deliver the strategy? How do you make sure the organization implements the strategy? So it's about the policies, it's about the procedures, those kind of actions, those kind of frameworks that you use to actually drive activity. So let's get into the three hats. So in a business, there are three main pieces. And as I mentioned earlier, when you register a business, there are three pieces that you have to register. You have to just say who is the shareholder. You have to say who is that first director. And if you don't have any management, well, then you really don't have an operating company. It's more of a holding company. So in order to have an operating company, you need all three. It's in the very nature of the way you create the business. So shareholders, directors, and managers are different in that they have different roles and responsibilities. So the reason I've chosen those particular shapes is that shareholders typically come from anywhere. They could be part of the business, they could be external to the business, they could be from other countries, other cities, they could have different shareholdings, different backgrounds. It's a very diverse group. And they have the opportunity to think in completely different ways. They have the opportunity to vote based on their numbers of shares, so they're not equal. Whereas the directors, the board in the middle, is a team of equals. You only have one vote. You are, the board is designed in such a way that you want to drive consensus. You don't want to be voting for things. Whereas shareholders, typically, it's a vote, whether the majority or two-thirds majority is, then that's how we move forward. Whereas a board should be voting as an absolute exception. It should be building consensus, and as I said, try to be building a team of equals where there aren't individuals that dominate that group. We want really clear, thorough thinking happening in that group. Whereas management is that piece at the bottom, is typically a hierarchy. There's typically some kind of hierarchy led by the CEO or MD, who acts as that connection between the board and the rest of the organization. Acts as that piece in the middle of an hourglass where the information flows up and down between the board and the organization through that individual. Where it becomes tricky is that shareholders have very specific responsibilities and they have very specific rights. So as a shareholder, you have the right to appoint directors and you have the right to remove directors. You have a right to return your investment, but that's about it. So once you've decided what the basic structure of the building, the business is it property, is it manufacturing, is it whatever it is, and whether there's specific boundaries you don't want an organization to operate outside. So that's pretty much where the shareholding bit stops. And then you make sure you build the team, build the directors that are then going to take the organization forward. So governance, the word governance comes from Kubinari, which is about a ship. It's about going to sea. It's about leading and driving a ship. So in that model, shareholders left its ship and at the harbor. The ship went out to sea. But in business, we typically think that shareholders should still be involved in operations and strategic decision making. And that's not the case. That's the realm of directors and management. So it's really critical to understand that there needs to be a hard line. And if you want to protect assets, you want to protect the trust, et cetera, there needs to be a clear divide between the decisions that were made at the board and decisions that were made as shareholders. The management and board line is obviously a bit more permeable because there's information flying backwards and forwards between the two. But it's still important to make sure there's a clear segregation between who is in the board and who is in management and when I'm wearing those particular hats. So for those of you who are shareholders, directors, and managers, it's really critical to understand which hat am I wearing when. When I'm making a decision, when I'm thinking through a problem, am I coming at it from a shareholder perspective, which is largely going to be driven about, do I need to put money in, or is it reducing the chance of me taking money out, or increasing the chance of me taking money out? You know, there's that kind of backwards and forwards from it's going to affect me from a tangible money perspective. Or the board is about, well, is it in line with the strategy, or should be in line with the strategy? So it's a different way of thinking, but if you're wearing both hats, it's quite difficult sometimes to make that separation. And if you're wearing all three, then what typically happens is that it's like water. The discussion drops to the lowest common denominator. So if most of your team are management and directors, the discussion at what you're thinking is a board meeting tends to be very operational. It tends to be about, are we going to hire and fire so-and-so, and are we going to buy a new car for the salesman? It's a very operational discussion. It tends not to be a strongly strategic discussion. When the arguments start happening and the hot air rises, then typically what happens, it goes up to a shareholder level. So I'm the majority shareholder, therefore, what I say goes. It's my business, blah, blah. Those kind of conversations start to happen at the shareholder level based on the shareholder hat. But again, that's not the conversation you should be having in a board meeting. So it's really important to try and bring in independent or at least non-executive directors into that board to try and hold that space, because it's a different group of people having different conversations. And you're not all the same, having lots of conversations at all the different levels. That's the only conversation this team has, is around strategy, governance, and the leadership of the organization as a whole. So everyone has a relationship with the company. Shareholders, as I said, it's very much a selfish relationship, because it's about, I've put in and therefore I want to receive. Company is completely opposite. It's totally selfless. In everything I do, it must be in the best interest of the company, not the best interest of me. And the Companies Act talks to that. King 3 talks to that in terms of principles. It's about making sure that we are only thinking of the business when we're in that space. And the complicated one is management, obviously, because you've got a selfish and a selfless relationship. You've got a contract, which makes it selfless, and you've got some kind of salary remuneration, which tends to have an impact on the selfish side. So I hope that makes sense. And just one last point for the entrepreneurs in the room. I'm sorry, guys, but you cannot own a business, just like you can't own a human being. A business is a juristic person. It is a legal entity in and of itself. So if you owned it, it would be slavery. What happens when we start saying, it's my business, I own the business, is we start to think of the assets and the resources as ours, as an extension of us. And it becomes problematic when you start using those resources, as I said, to the benefit of yourself rather than the benefit of the business. You start buying a vehicle because it's the vehicle you want, not what the business really needs. You start buying a property because it's in a nice area and it's maybe a good investment, but that's not what the business needs. So it's those kind of questions that start to come play. If we're coming at the question, coming at the decision, thinking we own it, it's our asset. We are a shareholder, we expect a return. Finished. We are a director and we drive the strategy of the organization, but we don't own the assets of the business. Okay, so quickly on director's duties. Obviously, this stuff is covered a lot in the course, and it's about this care, skill, and diligence. Really critical that we understand what that means, really critical that we're living that if anybody holds us accountable, that they can clearly see that we've demonstrated that. And then the fiduciary duties is about the acting in good faith, best interest of the company, conflict of interest, all of that stuff. So it's making sure that we're doing what's in the best interest of the business and we have the necessary skills to perform those duties. We're not doing things for personal gain, as it says in point C. So care, skill, and diligence. Care, approach to decision making. How do we approach the problem? How do we make the decision? Have we mapped it out? Have we written down all the steps, all the stuff that we considered? Do we have a template that breaks that down, that we have gone through and we've built on, where we discussed, these are the considerations we made at the time. This is the options that we discussed at the time. And then we decide to choose option B. So when you come back and look at that decision-making process in 12 months, 24 months, 5 years, typically, then you've got a clear way of representing and understanding how you got there. And those, the investors, banks, all of those kind of institutions that are giving money to an organization, and then need to understand the risks that they're letting themselves in for. So the more comprehensive your board papers are, the more comprehensive your decision-making process is documented. The better your decision-making process is documented, the more likely they are to feel comfortable that you're doing a good job, you're thinking things through, you're running the business professionally. In order to do that, there's obviously a degree of knowledge, commercial acumen, you need to be doing some self-development, building your EQ, building your understanding of governance, etc., etc. It's in the Companies Act that we need to continuously educate ourselves as directors. So what are we doing every year to try and improve our skills and abilities? And then diligence is that attention to detail. It's that mundane bit. It's the preparation. So when we're going into a decision, when we're going into a board meeting, have we read everything? Have we discussed it? Have we asked the questions? Have we done some research? So that when we're going through and making the decision-making process, we're applying our best thinking to it. And we're hopefully coming out with the best decision we can make based on the information we had available at the time. We haven't just thumb-sucked or, now that sounds good, let's go, which so often happens. And the bigger decisions, the bigger the business, then the more likely that is going to come back and hurt us. And the third part that's really not mentioned in the rules so much, but it's definitely something that comes out when you're looking at reputation is what you do and how you do it. So it's not just the output that people are measuring businesses by, it's very much the process in between. And we're definitely seeing that with the companies we're working at, where there's how important it is to demonstrate that good governance. Because there's so many more eyes looking in who are going to be curious to find out how good the governance process is. And again, the bigger the business, the more likely they're going to be scrutinizing you. So just about to get into the Applied Directorship program, but just for those of you who were here for the informational part, or what is it called? Advertorial, for the information part. This is the framework that we use for our training. This is the framework we use for our assessments. It's the framework we use for our guide process. So we've broken down strategy into 8 main components, and the circle is a great representation of the business, because purpose, sustainability, performance, and conformance, the north, south, east, and west components, are effectively forces that are pulling the business in different directions all the time. So the visual is we want to keep the business whole, we want to keep the business balanced, and we don't want to let any of these forces pull it too far in any one direction. We need to make sure we're aware of it and we bring it back. Because if you push performance too hard, what often happens is performance starts to slip. We start to be a little bit less careful with the way that we're disposing of waste, or we tend to use a little bit cheaper way of manufacturing without really necessarily checking whether there's any kind of labor practices that are being abused or whatever it might be, because we're pushing for that performance. And the purpose of sustainability is that, really driving the way that this is the mission of this business is, wow, it's so big and it's fantastic, but have we actually built the foundation to make sure that it's sustainable? Or we've gone too far, too fast, too quickly, too many areas in our enthusiasm about pushing forward the purpose and the strategy. So those of you who are interested in the Applied Directorship program, please stay on the webinar. For those of you who've got what you need, thank you very much. Thank you for being with us. Look forward to hearing from you in the future. So now I'll go into the Applied Directorship program. As a raised hand, Jenny, can you just check whose raised hand that was, if you can see it? Tokona Kokera, did you have a question to Tokona? Just please post your question. No question. Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so let's move on to the Applied Directorship program, and I'll make every effort to finish before 5 as advertised. So we want to make sure we've got time for questions. So what we're talking about is bringing all of this stuff, all of this understanding of what it means to be a high performance director, what it means to be a high performance board, the different strategic elements, the strategy, direction, organizational culture, effective leadership, all of those pieces together. And when we looked at all those components, we ended up with 8 modules because we needed to cover 8 segments. Well, then we needed 2 more modules to cover the introduction and build the boards and set up the program. And then by popular demand, after I think it was the 3rd or 4th time we ran this training, there was a very strong request for an 11th session, really to close it out, give everybody a chance to share their insights and ask questions and all of those kind of things, and have a bit of a farewell. So it's 11 months, and we've tried as hard as we can. We haven't been able to make it any shorter. And the idea is as far as possible, it's run as if you were working on a board of a company that was meeting for a monthly board meeting. So 4-hour face-to-face session, or on Zoom now, on the online world, Zoom session per month, and 8 simulated board meetings. So we run a company simulator, and you go through those 8 segments of the governance compass. Over those 8 meetings, you have board papers related to that subject, you have readings related to that subject, etc. And maximum 20 attendees, because we found much more than 4 boards in the room of 5 people just becomes a little bit too much to, not so much handle, but you lose the element of sharing and learning from each other. So we've set it as a maximum of 20 people. So yeah, please, if you're really interested, then please at the end register as soon as possible, because this next program is coming up soon. And this is all about, what do you do as a director? How do you learn to be a director? And we've been running training courses for 12 years now. And the reason why we decided we had to have something more practical, because you can't learn this stuff from a book. You need to do it. So the only way we could do it was to actually run board meetings, actually run them of the duration that was similar to real board meetings, have board papers that were similar to real board meetings, have a simulated company so you could compete against each other and make it a little bit more real. But the bottom line was, it's got to be practical. So just as a mountaineer in the analogy of Sirdar can't learn to climb by solely filling it, completing a mountaineering degree, you need to climb the mountain, test yourself, work out how the equipment to use practically, repeat, try again, etc. So this is about practical time in the boardroom, and it's absolutely critical to your success. So it's a foundation of what we're trying to do. So is this you? Is this something that you would benefit from? So if you run a business and are looking to implement a value-adding board, absolutely, you learn an immense amount about this, and certainly some of quite a few actually of the attendees start implementing this stuff as they're going through the course, and start bringing their other directors or forming their board along the journey of doing this training. Well, and they may use us to help and support that, or they may do that on their own. But it's very much about, do it in the classroom, do it for real. Go back, ask some questions, do the next thing in the classroom, come back and do it for real in the organization. Taking over a family business. So again, you need to make sure, if you're in that position where you're taking over a family business, have you got the skills and knowledge to do that, fulfill that role, to do the job? And if you don't, and you're not really confident, then it's absolutely essential that you develop those skills as quickly as possible. And I'm working with a family business at the moment where the entire family actually did the course, did the training. So at least everybody was on the same page. They had the same understanding of the concepts that we were talking about. So as we started to put the board together, at least everybody knew the why and the what's and the who and the how to try and get it going. So it's really, really important in a family business, because often the previous generation have never had to do all the stuff that we have to do now. They've never had to follow the rules that we have to follow now. They've never had to run the processes and never had the eyes on them in terms of checking their processes that we have now. Or if you were one of the aspirant non-executive directors or an existing non-executive director, we really cover all of the things that you need to know and understand in that role. So as I said, there's very much an emphasis on how do you show up, how do you make sure that you are that lone voice, and that comes from confidence. It comes from the deep level of understanding that this is the right thing to do. This is what it says in the act, this is what it says here, this is what practically it does, here's the book, if you don't believe me, etc., etc. It gives you an immense confidence going into the room to be able to have those tough conversations, which is absolutely critical as a non-executive director. Or you have the opportunity to become a director and you want to make a most value-adding contribution in the boardroom. So there's plenty of people coming up through the ranks, or they've been offered a position on a friend or a colleague or someone else's board. They've been applying for years, and now it's actually come through. They're going, oh, I actually need to get a bit of training because I'm not all that confident. So make sure the day you walk in the room, you know what you're doing. You can add value. That's the most important thing you can do in a boardroom, is add value quickly. Or you want to develop your skills further as a non-executive director. So those of you who've been a director for a while, I certainly came onto the program when we first started it with several years of being, or many years of being a director. And I learned an immense amount on the program, because there's so many things that you can't just learn from experience. You need to book learn, or you need to learn from someone else. You need to watch a video. You need to get that knowledge and understanding from someone else, whether it's an academic, whether it's a director who's been a director of a bigger, different business, whatever it might be. It's really difficult, if not impossible, to gain all the knowledge and understanding you need just from experience on serving on a board. And I would also add that most boards that we tend to serve on, not we, but generally as directors, most boards that directors serve on are pretty much dysfunctional because there isn't the proper process. They don't have the skills. They're learning from their predecessors who also didn't really understand how to run the process, etc., etc. So it's a bit like learning to drive from your parents. They're not necessarily the best place to learn the skills because things have changed. Or your executive director supporting the board process. This is becoming more and more important. I think as there's more and more focus on governance in general, it becomes absolutely critical that you build the knowledge of those lower and lower in the organization about how this board thing works. And we're seeing a lot more executive directors and just executives who may never be directors doing the training because they need, as part of fundamental part of their role, to support the board process. And if they know and understand how it works, then they can make sure that the board has the information it needs when it needs it, that it's accurate, that it's presented in the way that makes sense, that they can get to the point of making a decision quickly and effectively, etc., etc. And what companies say? So particularly when we're getting a client who's on the guide process or someone who's come to us who wants a director appointment, they're saying, give us directors who practice their skill and experience in boardroom. So for those who've only done a course, who've only done a course that has no practical element, it's really difficult to place them because you've got to get the first board placement before you can get a board placement. So we have already noticed significant difference in the employability, the placement ability of the individuals who've done the course and have therefore got some real experience of the issues of running through these processes with effectively complete strangers. You're in a boardroom with a board of 5 or 4 people that you may or may not have met before. You've got to make decisions, you've got to work together. You're under the clock because you've got this, you've got to make a decision before the board meeting's finished, etc., etc. Then you've got to go back and fit the rest of your life in whilst you're doing your board prep, whilst you're reading the books, etc., etc. So the idea of the training was, and making it monthly, was you've got a block of time exactly as you would have if you were on a board, but you've got life in between, and you need to find a way of planning things and setting up that methodology and the timings of when you meet and when you go to the papers and when you have your pre-boards with the team, etc., to make sure that when you get to that meeting, you're properly prepared and you can perform. So they will definitely have stories that you can tell an interviewer that I think will convince them you probably know more, if not significantly more, than the directors they already have on the board. Critical one to bear in mind is this question about whether a chief executive makes a good director or not. And often they don't, because the role is very different. So if you have a very strong, successful chief executive that comes onto a board, particularly as a non-executive director, their experience is being a CEO, which means they tend to clash with the CEO, or they do a lot of operational discussions rather than strategic discussions, because that's what you're comfortable with, that's what you're good at, that's what you know. Whereas as a director, you absolutely mustn't think as in the operational mode. It's got to be in the strategic mode and then converting it into a plan that then can be delivered operationally. So yes, operational understanding is very important. So broad understanding of business is really important. But if you go into the meeting with that chief executive mindset, then it's not going to be as effective as a non-executive director as it was when you were a chief executive in another business. So critical to be aware of that. We want to know that you, Sirdar, can confirm they know what they're doing. So if we have been with you on this journey for 11 months, it's much easier for us as an organization when making a placement, say, no, this person really knows what they're doing. They've managed the board meetings really well. The feedback after the sessions has been really insightful. I can see how they've progressed over the duration of the course. They've got their competence certificate, etc. So at least we've got some level of confidence that you've got a good understanding of all of the elements of governance. Whereas if we were just looking at your CV, for example, we wouldn't necessarily have that same insight. It's not about certification knowledge, it's about understanding. So we've taken the choice, and it's something we're looking at and reviewing about how we take it forward. This is a certificate, it's not a qualification, primarily because the way we want you to start to understand your role is in a director position, it's about self-reflection. It's not about examinations. You don't get regular exams as a director. You need to take and have the discipline, take the time and have the discipline to self-reflect after board meeting. So we build that into the methodology of the training to start building that rhythm so that when you're doing and practicing this in the real world, as it might, outside the course, you've already built that understanding of why it's important to reflect, why it's important to develop your knowledge in particular areas if you identify a gap, why it's important to understand, well, why did this board meeting go better than the previous one or worse than the previous one? What were the things that impacted it? Was it me? Was it the team? How do we improve, etc.? So we want to certify that you have the knowledge, but it's more about the understanding so that you can add value. So the certification is you've done the self-reflection exercise, you've watched all the videos, you've engaged in the sessions, you've attended all the sessions, and then if we're in any doubt at the end, is to have a conversation to sort of dig into what you've learned on the course. So we want to make sure you understand it, not that you just got book smarts. And it's really important to understand that if you don't have the time for the course, then you're going to struggle with having the time for being a non-exec director. It requires an enormous amount of time, energy, and guidance. And it's ultimately this whole ongoing commitment to your own development. If you want to be a properly effective director, this is not something you start and then you just carry on a flat line. This is something you need to learn, relearn, and unlearn, and it's an ongoing journey. It's almost like starting a completely new career. So often the experience you've had before is useful, but it's not necessarily something you can apply directly. So it's literally like moving into a new career. And if you treat it that way, then you'll find it much easier. The program overview. Critical thing is this is like an MBA, but it's not an MBA. This is very much about directorship, whereas an MBA is about business administration. It's about the management aspect. We follow a similar process because we've got the groups. You work in a group throughout the program. You do work together. You solve problems together. I would say the time commitment's nowhere near as significant as an MBA, but it's a similar time frame, similar process, monthly meetings, whatever it might be, and working in a group and team. And there's the blend of the practical stuff and the theoretical that's on the online platform, in books, in videos, in various other websites, etc. So it's a blended approach, very much focused on being a good director, which is very different from being a good manager. So if you want to do both, I recommend it. You end up with a much broader understanding of how business operates. If you want to move into the directorship space, then this is going to give you much more skill and knowledge and understanding than if you did an MBA and wanted to follow the same course. So it's up to horses to courses, I suppose, is the way of doing it. So, and it's not condensed. We didn't want to do this as a residential 2-week program, 4 hours, what it meant by, because it doesn't give you an understanding of how difficult it is to do this work in the real world. It doesn't give you the chance to actually absorb the information and try it again, and then practice and absorb it and try it again, practice, absorb and try it again, because it's just too quick. So you end the program and a month later, you've forgotten half and voila. Whereas 11 months, it's like developing a new habit. You've done all of these things at least 8 times over 8 months. And you've made the mistakes and you've learned from them and tried it again, and made the mistakes and learned from them and tried it again. So it's much more effective as an extended program than trying to cram it into a small places. And it's about not just, it's theory and simulation. We didn't want to go the route of theory versus simulation. We realized you need to actually do both. So we do the simulated board meeting with a simulated company, and you give the theory as well. So as I mentioned, there's 11 modules. So the main introduction one is module 1. That's on the 24th of March. There's the next opportunity to join the program. And it's when we give you a lot of the stuff we've done today with a lot more detail, a few practical examples, so you can have that aha moment of, oh, okay, now I see you do think, and you have to think differently with the director hat on compared with the shareholder hat and the manager hat, etc. So we want you to learn and experience that so that you can contextualize what comes next. Module 2 is very much more about the appointment of the boards. So appointment of the boards that you will then be working in from module 3 onwards, but also the theory of how to put together a board, what you need to consider, bring in profiling tools like Contribution Compass as one of the elements that you need to be thinking about when you're putting together this team that you call the board. So understanding how the process works, how the authority frameworks, pre-board planning, sort of overview of the methodology as well. So that's the second sort of introductory session. And then in month 3, you start to dig into the governance compass and you have your first real board meeting with your new company. Everyone else is in the same marketplace. Your company is unique, has its own name, it has its own branding, it has its own reporting. And now as a team, you need to decide what is your strategy going to be to differentiate yourselves from the other teams in the room who are doing the course. And then you work through all of these different elements with that same kind of process. Next is organizational culture. So we're firm believers that you need to start with the strategy. Where are you going? But the next most important thing is to make sure the culture is in line with the strategy. And there's that phrase, I can't remember at the moment who said it originally, the culture eats strategy for breakfast. It's more that you cannot implement the strategy unless the culture of the business is driving in the same direction. So you've got a strategy, say we're going to go over there, but the culture is taking over there. It doesn't matter what you do, the strategy is never going to be implemented. So it's critical as a board that we consider what is the culture now, what is the culture we need to drive that strategy, move it forward, how do we make it, what do we plan to change and how are we going to do it to get there, etc., etc. So it's a key piece of the puzzle as a part of the board process. Then the next piece is leadership, effective leadership. So you know where you're going, you understand what culture it is. Now you've got much better framework to recruit against. So when you're building your leadership team, you can check, does this individual have the right values fit, the right culture fit, etc. Are they going to help and support us moving forward in the direction we've defined in our strategy? So again, it gives you a framework you can work with. Now you've got all 3 of those elements in place. Now you can start to look outwards, and we take you through stakeholder engagement, all of the social and environmental responsibility, sustainability, etc. So how do you engage with them? How do you map that out? How do you manage that as a board as part of your strategic conversation? And there's templates for all of these things along the way. Then you talk about shareholder returns and expectations. So what does a statement of intent look like from the shareholder? What's the point of a dividend policy? Why is it important? Does it drive particular types of behavior and why and what would you want to do that for? All of those kind of things. So a lot more in depth than I ever realized when looking at that relationship between the board and shareholders, the business and shareholders. Then the last part is, not last part, but it's coming around the circle. You're moving up into the refining energy space, which is much more about data-driven and analytics. And we now start talking about risk. So what are the things you need to be considering as a board? How do you put together a risk matrix, etc.? How do you make sure you're running compliance? Then going to financials, budget setting, but thinking about the bigger picture, looking forward. And then the last piece is we do a board evaluation. So you get a chance to practice that, to actually experience that and go through that process, which should be an annual thing in any company to do that board evaluation. And then as I said, the 11th one is about how you bring it all together. So every seat is precious. We want to make sure that anyone who's sitting on the board that we're working with or has done our training is adding value as soon as possible. Contribution compass is what we use to help determine where the gaps might be in an organization and making sure that the team is balanced. So making sure, if you can see very quickly on a diagram like this, we've got the catalyst, the champion, the conductor. There's likely to be a bit of a gap in the inspiring and the sustaining energy. So understanding that, going through examples of that, working with that, reflecting on this concept and how it impacts the way the board operates, and so driving those 8 sections of the governance compass. Critical to remember, this is not a guarantee of appointment. We'll make every effort to help and support you to get that appointment, but we have over 1,000 people on our director network, and we can't guarantee that anyone who's done the applied directorship program is going to get appointed. all we can do is give you as much advice and help and support as possible. A bit like getting a degree is not necessarily mean you're going to get a job. Same applies. We can give you all the tools that you need, but there's a certain amount of luck and there's a certain amount of effort that needs to go into finding the opportunities. So it's about reinforcing, augmenting knowledge, developing understanding of the effective and integrated high-performance board and governance methodology. Be able to say that you've experienced the board, so you've lived that experience, you've now got some war stories you can tell about how it worked or didn't work, etc. And ensure a working knowledge of the tools. So you've been exposed to the way the agenda is set up, you've exposed to templates, you've exposed to decision-making and documents, etc. You've got a clear idea of what the toolbox looks like. Demonstrate that practical expertise in applying the methodology. So as I said, you've applied it. We can see the board papers that are coming out of the particular group and the way they're engaging with them. Identify areas of personal directorship, strengths and opportunities. So contribution compass is a great way of understanding self better and understanding what your strengths and challenges are. But also having been through the process, it's much easier to understand, well, what is my contribution in the boardroom? Where do I best show up? Am I a really good chairman, or am I someone who just sits back and is quiet and just listens and picks out those little nuggets of really important information that everyone else has missed? Is that my superpower? So then you can start to develop that, and you can start to move in the space where you're on the boards that needs that. And you go in with your eyes wide open. You receive a certificate of attendance if you attend 9 out of 11 of the sessions, and you receive a certificate of competence, and to say you've required the required level of competence and understanding and doing the program. So no time for this, no time for the boardroom, as I mentioned. If you can dedicate the time to this, then you will find being on the board much easier. If you're struggling to find the time for this, then you'll probably find being on the board and doing it properly quite difficult. So we recommend, if you can put aside 3 or 4 hours a week, then you should be pretty well covered. As I said, there's 4 hours for the board meeting, but there's time for prep, time for pre-board, and time to do reading. So it's something you need to build a rhythm during the month. That the first 2 weeks of the month, I get all the reading stuff done. The second 2 weeks of the month, I know I'm going to be doing my board prep, etc. Just like it is in the real world. 11 months, max of 20, 3 or 4 boards, 8 simulated board meetings, 4 hours per month. So as I said, 3 to 4 hours prep time. And the great thing about doing it online now is it's a much broader network of individuals. When we were running these in Johannesburg and Cape Town, much more difficult to do that. There's the numbers. So I'll leave those up on either scare you or you go, well, that's not too bad. Those are the numbers. That's how much it's going to cost you. We've got all kinds of payment plans. We can spread it out over the 11 months, etc. But that's the fee. In our estimation and in our research, not unreasonable, and in fact, very good value. What I'm offering today is, if you book before the end of this week, then we'll give you a $500 voucher that you can then put towards the program or put towards one of our other programs or spend on contribution compass profilers, whatever you want to spend it on with us. Please go to the link if you're keen to start. bit.ly ADP online. Jenny, if you can just put that in the chat box so people can find it easily. And as I said, it's an application. So we vet the applications, we make sure people have got sufficient experience to be able to fit in with the group. It's really horrible if you don't have enough experience to try and keep up with everyone in your group, and you're not going to be able to add value in your board if you haven't at least got some level of experience that's comparable with where you need to be from an executive perspective or from a director perspective. That's what the application form looks like. So you'll know you're on the right page when something like this appears, and it's just name and choosing the program on the first page, and then a little bit more information about why you want to do it. So again, as part of the vetting process, we can determine whether this is going to add value and maybe point you in a different direction, or have a conversation about what you're going to get out of it, how you're going to use it. Is it going to be value for money for you, a good investment for you? Questions? How many questions have we got on here, Jenny? So one here. How do you recommend that company secretaries, governance professionals transition? Let's get this one really. Transition from that role to being appointed as directors. Okay, good point. So they've got the professional experience of governance, but they may not have the practical experience of serving on a board. So that's really where it comes down to. It's how do I apply this knowledge I've developed, the book smarts, in the boardroom as a director, making the decisions, thinking about the information I need to talk about, and then leverage those years of experience. So you can apply those stories to your learning. On this board, actually, this decision went wrong. I didn't really understand why at the time, but now I can see that we didn't do X, Y, Z, etc. I've been a director for a number of years and feel my experience is adequate. I'm open to learning. So we've had quite a few people who've been on listed boards, large corporate boards, large family boards, multiple boards, who have come onto the program, and all of them have said, I wish I'd done this 10 years ago, 20 years ago, whatever, because I wouldn't have made that mistake, or I would have done that differently, or that company I was working with may or may not have gone to liquidation because I didn't know what I was doing at the level I needed to at the time. So it doesn't matter whether you're new to being a director or you're actually quite a seasoned director, there's definitely stuff that you will learn on this program. What else we got here? So Richard, understand that there's a program that helps with appointments as non-exec directors. So yes, this definitely helps with appointments. There isn't a separate one, but we can certainly sit with you and help you if you're struggling with that part of the process. We do webinars from time to time on that kind of thing. So obviously free webinars, you can listen and watch. Yes, but a large part of it is, can I demonstrate the experience and understanding when I walk into that interview or walk into the boardroom? Can I demonstrate that I actually know how the process works and I can add value by making the process more effective? What makes a great chairman? I would have to say, from my personal experience as a chairman, the critical thing is being independent. It's really, really difficult to be a good chairman if you are also thinking about the operations and various other things at the same time. I would challenge anyone who's CEO and the chairman that they are probably not doing one of those roles very well in a meeting. So the key part of the chairman role is to make sure that we build the proper agenda that covers all the things we need to cover. So it's work with the MD CEO to get that done and craft that agenda. Then make sure that the board papers talk to that agenda. So this is all before you've even gone to the boardroom. It's part of the job. There may well be some mentoring for the MD CEO along the way as well. Then when you run in the board meeting, I as a chairman absolutely have to have read every single paper. I need to know everything about those board papers. Because if no one else is asking questions, as the chairman, I have to be the one who's asking those questions. So it's critical that the chairman is better prepared than anyone else. The next piece is running the meeting. So you need to run the meeting according to the times you've given as far as you possibly can, without cutting things too short, but critically not letting the conversation dive into some operational conversation or rise up to a shareholder conversation that's not relevant to the context of the meeting we're actually holding as a director. So it's really important to manage the meeting, to chair the meeting. And then obviously, not obviously, but ensuring that each individual on the board gets their time in the sun. They get an opportunity to speak. They get an opportunity to share their experience. Obviously, as you get to know the team, then you start to understand better where those strengths are and when to call on them. But it's critical. No one else is going to do that. It's the chairman's job to run the meeting, make sure everybody's heard, and be the best prepared person in the room, so that you get to the point of making a decision that's been properly thought out, everything's been considered that needs to be considered, and then we summarize it effectively, sign off the resolution with really clear language, test the language, so there's no contesting the minutes afterwards, and then give it to the board secretary with clear directions so they write proper minutes. So it's a whole process. It's not just one thing. It's an art and a craft. So I hope that answers your question, Franklin. Thank you. It's a great question. What difference with these courses and ID courses? Fundamentally, it's the practical element. We've really focused this on the practical element. IOD is really focused on the theoretical element. So they do a really good job of teaching about King 4 and Companies Act. No question, I would highly recommend, if you need that level of understanding, then to do those courses as well. This is the then what. This is how do I apply that in the room, in my business? Why do I need it to understand this piece and that piece and the other piece? Where is it relevant when I'm making decisions? So it's the practical application that we've focused on very strongly. Doing the course, good question. Thank you, Anthony. What tools and software would you go home with? So we have an online platform that uses, at the moment, it uses a platform called Moodle. You have continuous access. We don't have an end date on it right now. At some point, there may well be. You have access to the materials for as long as you want. And that includes the videos, the readings, all the other things I've suggested. And then there's the Traversing the Avalanche book, which everybody gets. And depending on region, you may get a book related to the All Local Companies Act. There's a very good one that we use in South Africa, but we really struggle to find comparable books elsewhere. What have we got? Barrier between shareholders and board members. So yes, what I suggest is that the 3 hats I've explained is the aspirational. The reason why it's designed to be impervious is because there's a legal barrier there. So if, for example, there's a problem in the company and there's some kind of legal liability, if there's a very clear separation between shareholders and directors, then the liability stops at directors. And the worst you can lose as a shareholder is the money put in. If, however, there isn't a clear delineation, then what happens is the risk of the penalty moves up to wherever the money is. So there's a danger that you could put your trust in jeopardy, your wife's estate in jeopardy, your own house and estate in jeopardy that you thought you protected as a shareholder, because you're making all decisions at the same time. There's no difference in the forum. There's no clear delineation between your role as a shareholder making decisions as well as the director. And that's where it becomes really difficult in family businesses and private businesses. So it's sort of, and it's also just getting into the practice of thinking like a shareholder at least once a year. So it helps to have someone who's a shareholder and only a shareholder, even if it's your auntie who's put in 100 Rand, to have that opportunity to say, okay, with my shareholder hat on, is this business giving me what I need, etc. Richard, I've done that one. One of my goals this year is to prepare myself to be on the board of a Fortune 500 company. I think you need, well, basically you need experience, you need connections to get to a Fortune 500 company or even a listed company in South Africa. A large part of it's about who you know. Unfortunately, that's still the case. There will be particular skill requirements that will potentially get you in the door, but it's how do you demonstrate your skill? So one is obviously our training, another is to have served on various boards of significant size and work your way up, so like building a career. And the other one might be if it's relevant to give into that space, so maybe not Fortune 500, but certainly in listed companies in South Africa, is if you've got that certified director, there's some chartered director, sorry. Some people are finding that's a really useful way of getting the next level up. But the problem with it is you need to have been a director of a fairly significant sized company in order to qualify for that, to qualify to actually apply for that status. So yeah, it's a difficult one. No open questions. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you very much for staying on the extra few minutes. If there's anything else in the chat box, we've got the Educate Directorship program to give you further detail, downloads, etc. We've got the application form is in the chat box. Thank you. No other questions. I think we're all done. So quickly fill this in, please. See, you've got quite a few still online. Thank you. If you've got any further questions, then obviously we can give you a call. If you're looking for just a 30-minute consult about your business, you just need a hand and an understanding of how to take it forward, then please tick that one. Other training options, great. And then about director network. So if you're looking to develop your career as a non-executive director, I can highly recommend putting your name down in the network, and other board support services such as other education programs, our guide process, appoints, etc. Happy to help. Last question, what regions do you cover? So the director database is Africa-wide and also includes some people in Arab countries. From an office perspective, we have an office in Kenya, an office in Ghana, an office in two offices in South Africa. So we're trying to operate in East, West, and South Africa. So we go, use those offices as bases. And we have partners in Nigeria, for example. We have partners in Tanzania. And we have partners in various other places. So it's really about what does the particular country need? How big is that particular market? And we'll typically start with an education program in the region, see what the demand is. And then if there's sufficient demand, like Kenya and Ghana, we'll open an office there and then provide other support. But with guide services, they're supported remotely. So we don't have to be physically present these days. We do it on Zoom and through recordings. Education is done online. Again, we don't have to be physically present to be able to provide those services. So I'd say that now we are Pan-Africa, and we've even got people from the States and the UK and Australia that are also doing our courses. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your participation, and thank you for the follow-ups, questions. I'm looking forward to catching up with those of you who requested it. Anything else? Otherwise, we'll close the session now. I'm way over time. So apologies for that. I hope the time was well spent and you learned something, and we look forward to meeting those of you who are going to be joining the program or have other questions at some time soon. Thanks very much indeed. Cheers for now.